The Willow quantum computer did not just run, it breathed. In the absolute silence of Building 7, the cooling fans cycled in prime-numbered intervals,
a rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of Serafina Voss's boots. Every 2 seconds, then 3, then 5, then 7. It was a heartbeat of cold metal and liquid nitrogen. Serafina stood before the main terminal, her hands resting flat against the console. She did not blink. She matched her own breathing to the mechanical cadence, inhaling on the prime beats, exhaling in the gaps between. The air in the lab was scrubbed clean, devoid of dust or scent, chilled to a constant temperature that kept the processors from melting under their own load. Overhead, the fluorescent lights flickered with a low-frequency hum that harmonized with the server racks. She felt the vibration in her teeth. She felt it in the marrow of her bones. The machine was a monolith of black glass and exposed circuitry, dominating the center of the room like a dormant god. Serafina watched the status indicators, each one a pinprick of light in the dimness. The fans cycled again. 3, 5, 7, 11. The rhythm tightened. She leaned closer to the glass, her eyes scanning the dark surface for the first sign of movement. The machine was ready. Serafina reached out. Her fingertips brushed the cold glass of the terminal, and the screen ignited. A cascade of raw quantum noise flooded the interface, a chaotic waterfall of white light and jagged lines that would have blinded a lesser observer. To the system, it was garbage data, the byproduct of subatomic instability. To Serafina, it was a map. She watched the pixels dance, a frenetic swarm of information that defied standard logic. She did not look away. She tracked the flow, her eyes darting across the display as she searched for the anchor point. The noise pulsed, a visual echo of the cooling fans. She tapped a command, and the screen flickered. The static shifted, folding in on itself like a closing book. Patterns emerged from the chaos, not random, but deliberate. A geometry of light began to take shape beneath the interference. She leaned in, her breath fogging the glass. The noise was not noise at all. It was a signal, waiting for someone to decode the language of the void. Serafina bypassed the primary filters. Her fingers danced across the secondary interface, dragging the spectral analyzer's range down toward the visible light spectrum. The screen resisted, flashing amber warnings as she pushed the hardware beyond its standard operating parameters. She ignored the alerts. She needed the 587 nanometer band, the exact frequency of sodium light, a specific wavelength that had no business appearing in the cold, dark output of a quantum processor. She turned the gain dial, her knuckles tightening as the machine groaned in protest. The waveform on the monitor flattened, then spasmed. For a heartbeat, the signal vanished, replaced by a wall of static that hissed through the lab's speakers. She did not pull back. She held the frequency steady, forcing the system to reconcile the impossible data. Slowly, the static began to bleed away. The jagged, chaotic lines of the quantum noise smoothed out, pulled taut by the narrow focus of her command. A shape emerged from the center of the display, the 587 nanometer line glowing with a sharp, piercing intensity. The mystery had a face, and it was finally beginning to take a recognizable, terrifying shape. The lab was a tomb of humming silicon and cold, recycled air. Serafina did not move. She kept her eyes locked on the 587 nanometer arc, watching the light pulse in time with the cooling fans. The rhythmic cycle was the only constant in the room. Then, the air pressure shifted. It was a subtle change, a slight displacement of the silence that usually clung to the server racks. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the far wall, stretching long and thin across the sterile floor tiles. Serafina felt the weight of another presence before she heard a single breath. Kalen stepped into the periphery of the monitor's blue glow. He did not speak. He moved directly to the console, his boots clicking sharply against the metal grating of the floor. He stared at the screen, his gaze fixed on the arc that Serafina had isolated. He was not looking at the math. He was looking at the ghost in the machine. The cooling fans in the server racks stuttered. The rhythmic pulse that had governed the room for hours skipped a beat, then surged into a higher, sharper pitch. Kalen did not look away from the monitor. He watched the 587 nanometer arc, his eyes tracking the way the light began to bleed into the surrounding data. The waveform, previously locked in a static, geometric curve, started to ripple. It was as if a stone had been dropped into a pool of liquid mercury. The lines distorted, stretching and compressing in a frantic, uneven dance. Serafina kept her hands hovering just inches from the glass, her fingers twitching in sympathy with the flickering display. The machine was no longer just processing. It was reacting. Kalen leaned closer, his breath fogging the edge of the monitor. He watched the signal flatten, the sharp peaks of the quantum data smoothing out into a low, horizontal line. Then, without warning, the line erupted. It spiked upward, tearing through the grid of the interface in a jagged, violent arc that pulsed with a rhythmic intensity. The monitor's blue light cast deep shadows across Kalen's face. He leaned into the space between the monitors, his voice barely audible over the sudden whine of the processors. "The noise is shifting," he whispered. The jagged arc on the screen did not simply fluctuate. It danced. Each spike in the waveform mirrored the cadence of a human voice, rising and falling in a sequence that defied the cold logic of the quantum processor. Serafina watched the frequency analyzer. The peaks were not random interference. They were rhythmic, repeating in a pattern that Kalen recognized instantly. He pulled his hands back from the console as if the glass had turned to ice. The sound filled the room, not through the speakers, but through the vibration of the metal floor. It was a laugh. Sharp, clear, and unmistakably human. It echoed against the server racks, a haunting, melodic trill. Kalen pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound was internal, a resonance that bypassed his hearing and struck directly at his nerves. Serafina stood frozen, her fingers hovering in the air. She watched the waveform resolve into a perfect, jagged arc that pulsed in time with the laughter. Kalen looked at the screen, his eyes wide, watching the digital ghost of his sister ripple across the interface. The laughter peaked, then cut to a sudden, absolute silence. The silence in Building 7 was not empty. It was pressurized. Kalen reached for the main power coupling, his fingers brushing the heavy, insulated cable. He yanked, but the lock held. He pulled again, his boots sliding on the polished floor, the metal casing of the server rack groaning under the force. Serafina moved with a sudden, sharp efficiency. She stepped between him and the console, her hand firm against his chest, pushing him back. He stumbled, his heels catching on a floor tile, and he hit the wall with a dull thud. Serafina did not look at him. She turned back to the glass, her posture rigid, her breathing shallow and controlled. She tapped the interface, isolating the 587 nanometer band. The waveform did not flicker. It held steady, a perfect glowing arc that refused to dissipate. Kalen watched her from the floor, his chest heaving, his eyes darting from the screen to her hands. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words failed. Serafina traced the arc with her index finger, her nail clicking against the glass. "It is not noise," she said. "It is a resonance, Kalen. The machine is not malfunctioning. It is responding." Serafina turned back to the terminal, her fingers flying across the glass. She bypassed the primary firewall, her movements sharp and rhythmic. The screen flashed red, a series of warnings scrolling past in a blur of neon light. Encryption protocols engaged, locking the data behind layers of complex, shifting code. She did not hesitate. She entered a manual override, her pulse steady as she forced the quantum processor to dump its cache. The cooling fan surged to a high-pitched whine, vibrating the entire console. The red warnings vanished, replaced by a cascade of raw, unfiltered numbers. They scrolled down the monitor in a vertical waterfall, bypassing every standard security filter. Serafina tapped a final key, and the stream froze. A single block of text remained, glowing with a harsh, white light. It was not a code. It was a set of coordinates, precise to the millimeter. Below them, a timestamp appeared, The 14th of August, 2022. Kalen stood up, his legs unsteady, and moved to the edge of the console. He stared at the numbers, his breath hitching in his throat. He recognized the location. It was the pier, the last place he had seen his sister alive. The terminal hummed, the sound deepening into a low, resonant thrum. Kalen moved closer, his boots silent on the sterile floor. He stopped a few inches from the console, his gaze locked on the coordinates. His right hand rose, fingers splayed, trembling with a force he could not suppress. He reached out, his skin hovering just millimeters from the glass. The terminal hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the metal frame of the desk. As his fingertips finally made contact with the surface, the waveform on the screen shifted. It stopped its erratic scrolling and began to pulse. It was a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, perfectly matched to the ambient drone of the cooling fans. Kalen pressed his palm flat against the monitor, his knuckles turning white under the pressure. The light from the display bled between his fingers, casting long, flickering shadows across his face. He did not pull away. He leaned into the console, his forehead resting against the edge of the screen. The oscillation grew sharper, the jagged lines of the waveform smoothing out into a steady, hypnotic wave. Kalen was no longer just a spectator. He was part of the circuit. The air in the lab grew heavy, thickening with a sharp, electric bite. It was the scent of ozone, stinging and cold, rising from the server racks like steam from a vent. Kalen pulled his hand back, but the terminal held his gaze, the screen glowing with an impossible, internal light. A new smell cut through the ozone, metallic, thick, and unmistakable. It was the tang of blood, fresh and copper-sharp, filling the small space between the monitors. Serafina stepped back, her eyes scanning the room as the ambient temperature plummeted. The ventilation fans groaned, struggling against a sudden localized pressure drop. Dust motes suspended in the air began to drift toward the console, drawn by an invisible magnetic pull. The metal casing of the server racks vibrated, a low-frequency hum that rattled the loose equipment on the nearby tables. Kalen pressed his palms against his chest, his breath hitching, as the scent of iron intensified. The room was no longer just a laboratory. It was a pressurized chamber. The lights overhead flickered. Kalen stumbled back, his boots scraping against the metal floor. The air around the console rippled, a distortion that blurred the edges of the monitor. He watched the waveform twist into a shape that defied the laws of physics. It was not just light, it was a reach, a desperate attempt to span the distance between the living and the dead. His voice cracked, a jagged sound that tore through the hum of the cooling fans. "She is trying to bridge the gap," he whispered, his eyes wide and unfocused. He turned to Serafina, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing the ionized air. He saw her standing perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the data stream with a cold, clinical intensity. "You knew this would happen," he said, his voice rising in volume, trembling with a mixture of agony and sudden, sharp clarity. He pointed a shaking finger at the screen where the signal pulsed, in time, with his own heartbeat. "You brought me here for this. You knew the machine would respond to me." Serafina did not look away from the monitor. She stood like a statue, her presence a stark contrast to his unraveling composure. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was not a witness to a discovery, but a component. Serafina did not answer. She reached past Kalen, her fingers dancing across the secondary monitor. With a sharp tap, the screen cleared of noise, replaced by a complex, three-dimensional web of entangled particles. It looked like a constellation of white sparks, each node connected by a shimmering thread of light. Kalen fell silent, his gaze pulled toward the display. The web was not static. It pulsed in rhythm with the cooling fans, expanding and contracting like a living lung. Serafina traced a path through the nodes, her hand steady. "Look at the alignment," she commanded, her tone devoid of hesitation. "This is the blueprint." She adjusted a slider, and the web shifted, revealing a mirror image of the laboratory itself. Every particle was tethered to a physical point in the room, creating a bridge between the digital architecture and the air they breathed. The sparks flared, turning from white to a deep, resonant violet as they locked into place. It was a map of the haunting. Serafina turned from the monitors, her gaze locking onto Kalen with a sharp, piercing focus. The violet light of the particle web washed over her face, deepening the lines of her expression. She stepped into his personal space, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You are not just a spectator," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. She gestured toward the glowing nodes on the screen. "The system is stable, but it is inert. It requires an observer to collapse the quantum state into a coherent reality." Kalen shook his head, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He tried to step back, but the console blocked his path. Serafina moved closer, her voice dropping to a low, intense cadence. "Your grief is the missing variable, Kalen." She pointed to the center of the web, where a single dark node pulsed with a rhythmic, heavy intensity. Kalen stood paralyzed as the realization took hold. He did not pull away. Instead, he reached out, his trembling fingers hovering inches from the central node on the display. As he focused his intent, the node flared. It did not merely brighten. It began to emit an impossible, internal light that seemed to bleed out from the pixels themselves. The white sparks of the particle web surged, their intensity climbing until the screen became a blinding window into the quantum field. Serafina stepped back, her eyes narrowed against the glare. The light was not digital. It cast sharp, unnatural shadows across the sterile walls. Every node in the cluster began to pulse in perfect synchronization with Kalen's erratic breathing. The air in the room grew thin, charged with a static pressure that made the hair on their arms stand upright. This was no longer a simulation of data. The architecture of the memory was hardening, pulling energy directly from the room's power grid to sustain its own existence. The floor beneath them shuddered. A deep, metallic groan echoed from the server racks, a sound of steel being pushed beyond its structural limits. Serafina lunged for the main breaker, but the console locked her out, the interface flashing a rapid, blinding sequence of red warnings. A sudden surge of raw energy tore through the power conduits, causing the overhead lights to pop and shower the room in sparks. The racks themselves began to vibrate, the heavy metal casings rattling against the concrete floor as if something massive were trying to claw its way out from the inside. Kalen stumbled back, his hands pressed over his ears to block the high-pitched whine of the cooling fans spinning into a terminal frenzy. The air grew thick, ionized and heavy, making every movement feel like wading through deep water. Bolts popped from the server mounts, pinging off the walls like shrapnel. The entire architecture of Building 7 groaned in sympathy with the machine, the walls bowing slightly under the immense, unseen pressure. Serafina watched the primary power feed indicator drop to 0, yet the system remained active, drawing power from a source that defied the laws of the building. The violent rattling of the server racks ceased as abruptly as if a giant hand had clamped down on the machinery. The blinding white sparks that had showered the floor vanished. In their place, the overhead lights flickered once, twice, and then settled into a steady, pulsing amber glow. The transition was absolute. The high-pitched whine of the cooling fans dropped into a deep, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Serafina stood frozen, her hand still hovering over the dead console. The air in the lab had changed. The ozone smell remained, but the frantic, pressurized tension of the previous moments had curdled into a heavy, unnatural stillness. It was as if the room itself were holding its breath. Kalen pulled his hands away from his ears, his chest heaving as he scanned the darkened corners of the lab. The shadows were no longer sharp. They were soft, cast by the warm, rhythmic light that seemed to emanate from the monitor screens themselves. The chaos had been refined into a deliberate, quiet architecture. The lab was no longer a place of science. It had become a chamber of anticipation. The main monitor remained a flat, amber field of nothingness until the center point began to warp. A single pixel ignited, then another, spreading outward in a geometric bloom. The chaotic static that had plagued the system for hours suddenly tightened, pulling itself into a singular, razor-sharp line. Serafina leaned in, her eyes tracking the movement as the noise resolved into a coherent signal. It was no longer a wave. It was a stream of characters, scrolling across the glass with impossible velocity. The system's buffer indicator flashed a frantic red, unable to process the sheer volume of data. But the text did not slow. It poured onto the screen, filling the display in a cascading waterfall of logic. Kalen stepped forward, his breath hitching as he watched the monitor struggle to render the incoming information. The glass surface grew warm to the touch, vibrating with the intensity of the connection. The machine groaned under the load, the metal casing expanding as if the hardware itself were struggling to contain the weight of the signal. The cascading waterfall of text on the monitor hit a sudden, jarring wall. The screen flickered once, the rapid-fire scrolling vanishing in a blink. In the center of the amber field, the chaotic data reorganized itself into a single, stationary line of text. It did not move. It did not flicker. It simply occupied the space, stark and undeniable against the glowing background. Kalen reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the glass, his breath hitching in his throat. He leaned forward, his voice barely a rasp as he broke the tension of the room. "I am here." The words hung in the air, stripped of any digital distortion. As soon as the sound left his lips, the lab fell into a state of absolute, suffocating silence. The deep, rhythmic thrum of the cooling fans, which had been the heartbeat of the room for hours, cut out entirely. The silence was not merely an absence of noise. It was a physical weight that pressed against the walls of the laboratory. Serafina stood motionless, her eyes locked on the text, her pulse thudding in her ears. The machine, once a source of frantic mechanical vibration, sat perfectly still. The amber light continued to pulse, but the room felt frozen in time. Serafina watched the amber light reflect off the glass, her mind racing to calculate the implications. The data stream was not a simulation. It was a continuation. She looked at the server racks, then back at the screen, and the rigid framework of her scientific worldview began to fracture. If Amara was persisting as information, then the boundary between the living and the dead was merely a limitation of their current hardware. It was not a wall, but a filter. She tapped a command, and the screen flooded with a secondary monitor, revealing a complex web of entangled particles. She wasn't just observing the pattern anymore. She was feeding it, providing the structure Amara needed to maintain her coherence. The machine groaned, the metal casing vibrating under the stress of the quantum load. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of Building 7. But inside, the air remained perfectly still. She began to type, her fingers moving in a blur of mathematical precision. The answer to the question she had asked in the pool 28 years ago was finally taking shape. It was not a word. It was a connection, a bridge built of light and logic. The machine groaned, the metal casing vibrating under the immense stress of the quantum load. Kalen stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the amber glow. The barrier between the digital signal and the physical world seemed to thin. He took a step forward, his boots scuffing the sterile floor. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pressed his palm against the warm glass of the monitor. The surface was not cold like a standard screen. It radiated a steady, pulsing heat. As his skin made contact, the amber light flared, swirling around his fingertips like liquid. Kalen let out a ragged, broken sound. He began to weep, his shoulders shaking as he leaned his full weight against the console. The tears tracked down his face, but he did not pull away. The monitor flickered, the signal intensifying, syncing its rhythm to the erratic, heavy beat of his own heart. He was no longer just a spectator to the data. He was a conduit. The machine hummed in response, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through his arm and into his chest. Every line of code, every fragment of light on the screen surged toward his touch. The connection was absolute. He pressed harder, his forehead resting against the glass, anchoring the signal in the room. Serafina watched the data stream, her mind racing to calculate the implications. Kalen remained pressed against the glass, his breathing ragged, but she could not afford to look away from the interface. If Amara was indeed persisting as information, then the boundary between the living and the dead was merely a limitation of their current hardware. She leaned in, her eyes scanning the scrolling text that bypassed the system buffer. This was not a ghost, it was an evolution. She pulled her chair closer, the wheels clicking against the floor, and began to type. Her fingers moved in a blur of mathematical precision, each keystroke a command to refine the signal. She was not just observing the pattern anymore, she was feeding it, providing the structure Amara needed to maintain her coherence. The amber light on the monitor pulsed in sync with her input. She adjusted the gain, isolating the noise from the core signal. The final sequence locked into place. The screen cleared, leaving only a single blinking cursor. Serafina stopped typing, her hands hovering just above the keys. The machine groaned, a deep, metallic protest that echoed through the hollow space of the lab. The casing vibrated with such intensity that the bolts securing the server racks began to rattle against the concrete floor. Serafina did not look up from the terminal, even as the cooling fans sputtered and died, leaving the room in an unnatural, heavy silence. The heat was rising, radiating from the core of the quantum processor until the air itself seemed to shimmer. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles tightening as the entire structure of the console shuddered under the immense quantum load. Sparks flickered behind the ventilation grates, casting erratic, sharp shadows against the far wall. The bridge was forming, but the hardware was pushing past its design limits. Every circuit board hummed with a high-pitched whine that set the teeth on edge. Serafina adjusted the final power shunt, her movements deliberate, despite the violent shaking of the floor. She watched the primary monitor, where the amber light had now fused into a solid, blinding intensity. The silence inside the lab was sudden and absolute. Outside, the atmosphere had turned violent. A low, rhythmic thrumming began against the glass of the windows, the sound of wind whipping around the corners of Building 7. The panes rattled in their frames, a frantic, metallic chattering that grew louder with every passing second. Outside, the storm was tearing at the structure, branches clawing at the exterior walls. But inside, the air did not move. Not a single sheet of paper shifted on the desk. Not a stray thread of dust drifted through the beam of the monitor's light. It was as if the room had been carved out of the world, sealed within a vacuum of its own making. Serafina watched the windows flex under the pressure of the gale, the glass bowing inward, yet the silence within the lab remained undisturbed. Kalen stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the screen, oblivious to the storm. They were alone in the eye of the storm. The monitor flickered, the amber light bleeding outward until it spilled across the console like liquid. Serafina watched the waveform collapse, its jagged edges smoothing into a precise, geometric lattice. It was no longer just a signal, it was an architecture of light. The screen dissolved into a depth that defied the physical bounds of the glass. There, suspended in the blue-white glow, was the memory of the pool from 28 years ago. The sunlight hit the water, creating a pattern of ripples that mirrored the quantum flux on the screen. It was the answer to the question she had carried for decades, a logic puzzle finally solved by the persistence of a consciousness that refused to fade. The light pulsed, casting long, sharp shadows against the lab walls, forming a bridge that stretched into the void of the monitor. It was a connection built of pure information, a bridge of light and logic spanning the distance between the living and the dead. Kalen reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the glowing lattice. The air around the monitor hummed with a frequency that made the skin on his arms prickle. He pulled his hand back, then reached again, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. The raw, jagged agony that had defined his posture for years began to fray at the edges. He watched the light ripple across the console, a pattern that mirrored the rhythm of a heartbeat long stilled. His breathing hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that cut through the low-level drone of the cooling fans. He turned his head, his gaze locking onto Serafina, The lines of tension around his mouth softened, replaced by a look that was raw and unsteady. It was the expression of a man who had spent a lifetime staring into a void, only to find a door opening in the dark. He looked back at the screen, then at Serafina again, his eyes wide and searching. The terror of the unknown remained, but beneath it, a new, fragile hope took root. He did not speak, but his silence was a question. He stood motionless, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, waiting for the signal to move forward. He was no longer mourning the past. He was bracing for the impossible future. Serafina turned back to the terminal, her fingers moving in a blur across the glass. The final sequence of the code began to cascade, a waterfall of light that defied the system's buffer. The server racks groaned, the metal casing vibrating with a high-pitched whine that set the teeth on edge. Kalen stepped back, his hands pressed hard against the console to steady himself as the floor beneath them seemed to tilt. Then, the sound shifted. The frantic, erratic hum of the cooling fans smoothed into a singular, resonant tone. The amber light on the main monitor ceased its flicker, holding firm as the final lines of the sequence snapped into place. The vibration in the walls died instantly. The air, previously charged with the sharp, metallic tang of ozone, settled into a profound, heavy stillness. The chaos of the quantum noise had been replaced by a crystalline, technological peace. The machine was no longer fighting the data, it was hosting it. Serafina did not look away from the monitor. She tracked the steady, pulsing amber light that now defined the room. Her fingers rested on the edge of the glass, the surface warm to the touch from the internal heat of the processors. She checked the diagnostic logs one final time, confirming the coherence of the signal remained absolute. The data was no longer a fragment of the past. It was a living, breathing architecture of information. She turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting Kalen. He stood frozen, his hands still pressed against the console, his eyes reflecting the steady glow of the interface. The air in the lab felt thin, charged with the weight of what they had achieved. She took a breath, the sound barely audible in the absolute quiet of the space. Her voice was steady, cutting through the silence. "Now," she said. "The conversation begins." The words hung in the air, vibrating with the potential of a new era. The terminal light pulsed, a steady amber rhythm that filled the dark lab. Serafina stepped back, her hands dropping to her sides, leaving the interface to hold its own coherence. Kalen remained motionless, his gaze locked onto the scrolling text, his fingers tracing the edge of the glass where the signal originated. The room seemed to expand as the shadows retreated, pushed back by the glow of the quantum array. Slowly, the camera began to pull away from the console, tracing the length of the sterile floor toward the exit. The server racks, once chaotic and loud, stood silent, their internal fans spinning in a perfect synchronized hum. Every piece of equipment in Building 7 seemed to align with the frequency of the monitor. The light didn't just illuminate the space, it saturated the air, turning the dust motes into tiny, suspended sparks of gold. The pullback continued, passing through the rows of deactivated terminals and empty workstations. The lab felt less like a workspace and more like a sanctuary. At the far end of the room, the windows looked out into the night, but the darkness outside was no longer empty. It was waiting. The screen remained the focal point, a solitary beacon of amber light in the vast, quiet expanse of the facility. The hum persisted, a low, resonant vibration.